It was a chilly Monday morning, and the man standing in line at the airport looked just like any other traveler. He wore faded jeans, a hoodie that had seen better days, and sneakers that squeaked slightly as he shuffled forward. His face was clean-shaven, but there was something about him, a certain sharpness in his eyes, that hinted he wasn't exactly who he appeared to be. This man was the head of one of the biggest airlines in the country. People knew him as the guy who made big decisions in fancy boardrooms, surrounded by charts, graphs, and executives in tailored suits. But today he was just another passenger clutching a coach-class ticket he'd bought under a fake name. Why would someone so powerful choose to fly economy instead of relaxing in first class or even taking a private jet? Well, it all started with complaints, lots of them. Over the past few months, emails and reports had piled up on his desk. Passengers were unhappy. They said the service was getting worse, the food options were laughable, and the seats felt like they were shrinking every time they flew. Employees weren't happy either. Some whispered about long hours, low pay, and feeling unappreciated. He could have called another meeting, sat behind his polished mahogany table, and listened to managers explain what was going wrong. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't cut it this time. If he really wanted to understand the problem, he needed to see it for himself. So here he was, blending into the crowd, ready to experience the airline from the ground up, or rather, from 35,000 feet in the air. As he reached the front of the security line, he adjusted the backpack slung over his shoulder. Inside there was nothing special, just a water bottle, a book, and a notepad. No expensive gadgets, no flashy accessories. He wanted to look ordinary, invisible. After clearing security, he headed to Gate 27, where the plane was waiting. When he finally stepped onto the aircraft, he paused for a moment, letting the scene sink in. The cabin smelled faintly of plastic wrap and reheated meals. A flight attendant greeted him with a polite smile, though her tone suggested she'd already said, "Welcome aboard," 100 times that day. He nodded back, careful not to draw attention to himself, and made his way toward his seat. His spot was near the back of the plane, squeezed between a young couple scrolling through their phones and an older man reading a newspaper. As he stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, he noticed how tight the space felt. Sure, he'd flown coach before, but always briefly, usually during inspections or quick trips. This time, though, he wasn't leaving until the plane touched, down at its destination. Settling into his seat, he glanced around. Families wrestled with carry-ons, kids squirmed impatiently, and business travelers tapped away on laptops. It was a snapshot of everyday life, raw and unfiltered. For a moment, he forgot about being the boss. Here, he was just another person, trying to get from point A to point B. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its slow crawl toward the runway. He leaned back, pretending to scroll through his phone while secretly observing everything around him. How did the crew interact with passengers? Were people comfortable? Did anyone seem frustrated or annoyed? These were questions he couldn't answer from a boardroom. But then something unexpected happened. Two voices drifted toward him from the galley behind him. At first, he thought nothing of it. Flight attendants often chatted during downtime. But as the conversation grew louder, snippets of their words caught his attention, and what he heard next froze him in his seat. What those two crew members were saying wasn't just casual gossip. It was a window into the heart of the issues plaguing the airline. Their words painted a picture far more complex than anything he'd read in reports or heard in meetings. Suddenly, his undercover mission took on a whole new level of urgency. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as it taxied down the runway, but the man in the worn hoodie barely noticed. His focus was on the conversation happening just a few feet away, behind the thin curtain that separated coach from the galley. Two flight attendants were talking. Quietly at first, but their words carried enough for him to catch every detail. "You've got to be kidding me," one of them said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Did you hear about the new snack policy? They're cutting back even more, pretzels and peanuts if we're lucky, that's it. What are we supposed to tell passengers when they ask for something else?" The other attendant let out a dry laugh. "Tell them to bring their own food next time. Honestly, I don't know how much longer I can do this." It feels like they're nickel and diming us and the customers at every turn. The man in the hoodie shifted slightly in his seat, pretending to adjust his backpack. He didn't want to seem obvious, but he couldn't help leaning just a fraction closer. These weren't complaints about bad weather or delayed flights. They were deeper, rawer. "And have you seen the uniforms?" The second attendant continued, lowering her voice but still loud enough for him to hear. "They look cheap, feel worse, and don't even last a month before they start falling apart. Corporate says it's cost-effective, but all it does is make us look unprofessional. Passengers notice these things, you know." The man winced, inwardly. He remembered the meeting where the new uniforms had been approved. The design team had presented slides showing sleek lines and modern fabrics. Everyone had nodded along, congratulating themselves on saving money while keeping the brand image intact. But here, hearing it from someone who actually wore those uniforms day in and day out, the truth felt painfully clear. They'd gotten it wrong. "Don't get me started on scheduling," the first attendant chimed in again. Her tone was sharp now, bordering on angry. "I worked 3 doubles last week, 3, and guess what? No overtime pay because they classified it as voluntary." "Voluntary? Like I had a choice. If I say no, they'll just cut my hours next month." Her coworker sighed heavily. "Same here. My manager keeps saying we're all in this together, but it doesn't feel that way. Feels like they're piling everything onto us and expecting miracles. Meanwhile, passengers are getting crankier, and we're stuck dealing with it." The man sank deeper into his seat, his mind racing. Every word they said struck a chord. He knew about the budget cuts, of course. He'd signed off on many of them. At the time, they'd seemed necessary. Fuel prices were rising, competition was fierce, and shareholders demanded results. But sitting here now, listening to the real-world impact of those decisions, he realized something important. Numbers on a spreadsheet didn't tell the whole story. A child nearby started crying, breaking the tension momentarily. One of the attendants stepped out of the galley to hand the toddler a small packet of cookies. The parents thanked her, but she offered only a tight smile before retreating back behind the curtain. "They don't care," the second attendant muttered once she returned. "Corporate, I mean. They sit in their fancy offices and crunch numbers, but they don't see what it's really like out here. We're stretched so thin it's a miracle anything gets done." The man clenched his jaw, guilt gnawing at him. He wanted to stand up, walk over, and tell them he was listening, that he cared, that he hadn't fully understood until now. But he stayed put, knowing that revealing himself would only complicate things. Instead, he pulled out the notepad from his backpack and jotted down a few notes. "Uniforms too cheap," he wrote. "Snack options insufficient. Staff overworked." As the plane lifted off the ground, climbing steadily into the sky, the conversation shifted, slightly. The first attendant leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "Remember Mr. Peterson last week, the guy who got bumped because we overbooked?" "Oh yeah," the second one replied. "That was brutal. He was furious, yelling about how he needed to get home for his daughter's graduation. I felt awful. But there was nothing I could do. Corporate said it was necessary to maximize profits." "Necessary for who?" the first snapped. "Not for him, not for us, just for some number on a report." The man stared out the window, watching. Clouds drift past. He thought about Mr. Peterson, the father trying to make it home for his daughter's big day. He thought about the attendants, exhausted and frustrated, doing their best under impossible conditions. And he thought about himself, sitting there, in disguise, realizing just how disconnected he'd become from the reality of the airline he ran. For years, he'd prided himself on being a leader who listened. But now he saw the truth. He hadn't been listening closely enough. Not to the people working the front lines and not to the passengers relying on the service his company provided. The flight attendants eventually moved on to lighter topics, discussing weekend plans and sharing stories about funny passenger interactions. But the weight of their earlier words lingered in the air. For the rest of the flight, the man sat quietly, absorbing everything around him. Every creak of the seat, every sigh from a tired traveler, every polite "thank you" exchanged between crew and passengers. It all felt different now. sharper, more real. By the time the pilot announced they'd reached cruising altitude, he'd made up his mind. This wasn't just an undercover trip anymore. It was a wake-up call. And when the wheels touched down at their destination, he knew exactly what he needed to do next. As the plane settled into its cruising altitude, the chatter between the two flight attendants died down. One of them disappeared into the galley to prepare for the beverage service, while the other walked slowly down the aisle, handing out tiny bags of pretzels to passengers. The man in the hoodie watched silently, his mind still replaying their earlier conversation. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the scene. A young couple near the front row was scrolling through photos on their phones, laughing softly. Behind them, a businessman typed furiously on his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. Across the aisle, a mother struggled to calm her restless toddler, who kept trying to climb over the armrest. It was a mix of everyday moments, each one playing out against the steady hum of the engines. But what struck him most was how tired everyone seemed, not just the crew, but the passengers too. There was an unspoken weariness in the way people slouched in their seats or stared blankly out the windows. It wasn't hard to see why. The seats were cramped, the air felt stale, and the snack options were laughable at best. Flying used to be exciting, something people looked forward to. Now, it felt like a chore. The thought weighed heavily on him as he turned his attention back to the flight attendant, making her way down the aisle. She stopped beside an older woman sitting across from him and handed her a cup of water with a polite smile. The woman thanked her warmly, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of connection, a shared humanity that transcended the frustrations of the day. Curious, the man leaned forward slightly to catch a glimpse of the older woman. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a pair of glasses perched on the edge of her nose. On her lap rested a well-worn book, its cover faded from years of use. Something about her presence felt calming, almost grounding. When the flight attendant moved on, the older woman caught his eye and smiled. "First time flying this route?" she asked kindly, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. He hesitated for a second, unsure how much to reveal. "Not exactly," he replied, keeping his tone casual. "But it's been a while since I've flown coach," the woman chuckled softly. "Ah yes, coach, not quite the luxury experience it used to be, is it?" "No," he agreed, leaning back in his seat. "It's definitely changed." She nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting toward the window. "I remember when flying was something special. Everyone dressed up, men in suits, women in dresses. The seats were wider, the meals were hot, and the stewards—" She trailed off, smiling at the memory. "They treated you like royalty. You could tell they loved their jobs." Her words resonated deeply with him. He'd heard similar sentiments before, usually from executives reminiscing about the golden age of air travel. But hearing it now, from someone who had lived through those times, made it feel more personal. "It must have been nice," he said, genuinely interested. "Oh, it was," she replied. "But it wasn't just about the food or the fancy uniforms. It was the way you were treated, with respect, care, even joy. These days—" She paused, glancing around the cabin. "Well, let's just say things are different." He nodded, slowly, encouraging her to continue. "Take today, for example," she went on. "I flew this same airline last month, and my luggage didn't arrive until 2 days later. When I called customer service, I got passed around from person to person. No one seemed to care. And then there's the seating. It's like they're squeezing us in tighter every year. Don't get me wrong. I understand businesses need to make money. But sometimes I wonder if anyone remembers that we're human beings, not cargo." Her honesty took him aback. He wanted to defend the airline, to explain the challenges of running such a massive operation. But deep down, he knew she was right. Somewhere along the way, the focus had shifted from serving people to chasing profits. "You sound like you've seen a lot of changes," he said, steering the conversation gently. "I have," she admitted. "I've been flying since I was a teenager. Back then it was magical. Now, it's just practical. I don't mean to complain. I'm grateful to still be able to travel. But it's hard not to notice how far things have fallen. For the next few minutes, they talked about everything from airport security lines to the decline of in-flight entertainment. She shared stories of her travels, describing breathtaking landscapes and unforgettable encounters. Despite the hardships, she mentioned, her love for flying shone through. When the conversation finally wound down, she closed her book and tucked it into her bag. "Thank you for listening," she said with a warm smile. "It's refreshing to talk to someone who actually seems interested." "Thank you for sharing your perspective," he replied sincerely. "You've given me a lot to think about." As she settled back into her seat, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing numbers or improving efficiency. It was about restoring the magic, the humanity, that had once defined air travel. When the beverage cart rolled by again, he accepted a cup of coffee, though he barely touched it. His mind was racing, piecing together everything he'd learned so far. The flight attendant's frustrations, the older woman's nostalgia, the subtle discontent etched on the faces of his fellow passengers. Each piece of the puzzle painted a clearer picture. The airline had lost its way. But it wasn't too late to find it again. By the time the pilot announced they'd begin their descent, he'd already started forming a plan. He didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to business, as usual. Not after this flight. As the plane descended through the clouds, he glanced out the window, watching the city lights grow closer. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And when it did, it would start with listening to the voices of those who mattered most. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, and the cabin erupted into the usual post-landing shuffle. Passengers reached for their bags, kids squirmed impatiently in their seats, and phones lit up as people switched them back on. But the man, in the hoodie, stayed seated, his mind still swirling with everything he'd seen and heard during the flight. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, he unbuckled himself but didn't move to grab his backpack just yet. Instead, he glanced toward the galley where the two flight attendants were busy tidying up. They looked tired, exhausted even, but they moved efficiently, stacking empty cups and stowing away leftover supplies. He knew this was his chance. If he wanted answers, real ones, he had to act now. He stood up slowly, careful not to block the aisle as passengers filed out. Then, with a deep breath, he approached the galley. One of the attendants noticed him immediately and gave a polite nod, the kind reserved for passengers who linger too long. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone friendly but firm. "I hope so," he replied, offering a small smile. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you do. It's not easy, is it?" Her expression softened slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. "It has its moments," she said cautiously. "But yeah, it's definitely a tough job sometimes." The other attendant joined the conversation, wiping her hands on a towel. "What brings this on?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not many people stop to say thanks." "Well, I figure it's worth saying," he said, shrugging. "You guys deal with a lot, and most of us don't realize how hard it can be. Flying isn't exactly fun these days, not for passengers, and definitely not for the crew." The two women exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. "You sound like you've been through it before," the first one said. "Let's just say I've seen both sides of the equation," he replied vaguely. "But honestly, I'm curious. What would make your jobs easier? Or better? What would make flying better for everyone?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Finally, the second attendant sighed and leaned against the counter. "That's a big question," she admitted. "Where do we even start?" "How about with the little things," he suggested. "Like the snacks or the uniforms or scheduling?" At that last word, both women stiffened slightly. Clearly it hit a nerve. "Scheduling's a nightmare." The first attendant blurted out, her frustration bubbling over. "They keep adding shifts without paying us overtime, and if we try to push back, they threaten to cut our hours. It's exhausting." "And it's not just about the money," the second added quickly. "It's the toll it takes on us physically, mentally. We're running on fumes half the time. And when something goes wrong, a delay, a rude passenger, it feels like the whole world blames us. He nodded thoughtfully, absorbing every word. What about the passengers? Do you think they notice all this? Some do, the first attendant replied. Most don't care until something affects them directly, like when their bags get lost or their flight gets canceled. Then they're furious, and sure, some of that anger is justified. But a lot of it comes from frustration with the system, not with us personally. It's like we're stuck in the middle, the second chimed in, between corporate and the customers. Either side seems happy, and we're the ones left holding the bag. The man frowned, feeling the weight of their words settle over him. They weren't just describing problems. They were describing a culture, a system that prioritized efficiency over empathy, profits over people. What about communication? He asked after a pause. Do you feel like your voices are heard? When something's not working, does anyone listen? Both women laughed bitterly at that. Not really, the first said. We fill out surveys, send emails, bring up issues in meetings, but nothing changes. It's like shouting into the void. We're the ones on the front lines, the second agreed. We see what works and what doesn't. But when we try to explain, it's like no one cares. Or worse, they think we're exaggerating. He felt a pang of guilt. How many reports had landed on his desk only to be skimmed and set aside? How many emails had gone unanswered because there simply wasn't enough time or will to address them? You know, he said quietly, you're right. People should listen more, especially the ones making the decisions. The two attendants exchanged another glance, this one tinged with suspicion. Why does it feel like you're fishing for something? The first asked bluntly. He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But then he remembered why he was here. To understand, to learn, to change. I guess I am, he admitted, because I want to fix things. Not just for passengers, but for you too. You deserve better. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of engines winding down. Then, the second attendant spoke, her voice softer now. It's nice to hear someone say that, she said, but talk is cheap. Actions matter more. You're absolutely right, he replied, meeting her gaze. And I promise you, this isn't just talk. Whatever happens next, your voices will be part of it. With that, he stepped back, giving them space to finish cleaning up. As he walked back to his seat to retrieve his backpack, he couldn't shake the intensity of the conversation. These weren't just employees following orders, they were people with hopes, fears, and dreams. People who showed up every day despite the challenges to do their jobs. When he finally stepped off the plane, the cool air hit him like a wake-up call. Around him, passengers streamed toward baggage claim, eager to reach their destinations. But he lingered for a moment, looking back at the aircraft. This flight had changed him. It had stripped away the layers of spreadsheets and boardroom jargon, leaving behind something raw and real. For the first time in years, he saw the airline, not as a business to manage, but as a community to nurture. The man stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, his mind racing with everything he'd experienced. The flight attendants' frustrations, the older woman's nostalgia, the quiet exhaustion etched on passengers' faces. It all swirled together in his head like pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. But as he walked through the crowded airport, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't just about fixing problems. It was about restoring trust. Trust between the airline and its employees, and between the airline and its passengers. He reached the baggage claim area and found a quiet corner to sit down. Pulling out his notepad, he flipped it open and stared at the scribbled notes he'd jotted during the flight. Words like uniforms, snacks, scheduling, and communication jumped off the page, each one highlighting a crack in the foundation of the company he led. But there was something else too. A recurring theme that tied everything together. Respect. Respect for the people who worked tirelessly to keep flights running smoothly. Respect for the passengers who relied on the airline to get them where they needed to go. And perhaps most importantly, respect for the shared humanity that connected everyone involved. As he sat there, pen poised over paper, he began to sketch out a plan. It wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But he knew it had to start somewhere. He divided his thoughts into three main areas: improving conditions for employees, enhancing the passenger experience, and bridging the gap between the two. First, he thought about the flight attendants. Their complaints about uniforms hadn't been trivial. They were a reflection of how valued or undervalued they felt. Cheap materials and poor design didn't just make uniforms uncomfortable. They sent a message that the company saw its staff as disposable. That had to change. He wrote down ideas for involving employees in the redesign process, ensuring the new uniforms were both functional and dignified. Then there was scheduling. The stories of double shifts and unpaid overtime gnawed at him. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a system that prioritized cost-cutting over well-being. He made a note to review staffing policies and explore ways to reduce burnout without sacrificing efficiency. Maybe flexible hours or bonus incentives could help ease the burden. Next, he turned his attention to passengers. The older woman's memories of air travel's golden age lingered in his mind. While bringing back hot meals and spacious seating might not be feasible, there were smaller touches that could make a big difference. Better snack options, more legroom in economy, and improved customer service training for staff. All these changes could bring back some of the magic she missed so much. But the biggest challenge and opportunity was communication. He realized now that the disconnect between corporate and frontline workers wasn't just frustrating, it was damaging. Employees felt unheard, and when employees felt unheard, so did passengers. He jotted down plans for regular feedback sessions, anonymous surveys, and even town hall meetings where anyone could voice their concerns directly to leadership. By the time he finished writing, the terminal had grown quieter. Most of the passengers from his flight had already left, their rolling suitcases clicking against the tiled floor as they disappeared into the night. He glanced at his watch and stood up, tucking the notepad back into his backpack. There was no time to waste. When he arrived home, he barely paused to unpack before heading straight to his laptop. For hours, he pored over reports, emails, and memos, cross-referencing what he'd learned on the flight with data from the past year. Patterns emerged, patterns that confirmed everything he'd suspected. Employee morale was at an all-time low. Customer satisfaction ratings were plummeting. And yet profits remained stable, masking the deeper issues beneath the surface. Early the next morning, he called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. When they gathered around the conference table, coffee cups in hand, he wasted no time getting to the point. "I took a flight yesterday," he began, his tone serious. "Coach class, Undercover." The room fell silent. No one spoke, but the looks on their faces said it all. Surprise, curiosity, maybe even a hint of nervousness. "What I saw and heard changed my perspective," he continued. "Our employees are struggling, our passengers are unhappy, and we're losing sight of what matters most, the people who make this airline run." He went on to share specific examples from the flight, quoting the flight attendant's words verbatim. He talked about the cramped seats, the lackluster snacks, and the exhaustion written on every face. Then, he presented his plan. "We need to reinvest in our people," he said firmly. "Better uniforms, fairer schedules, more resources for passengers. We also need to listen, not just hear, but truly listen, to what our employees and customers are telling us. This isn't just about making numbers look good. It's about building something sustainable, something meaningful." The executives exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by his candor. One of them finally spoke up. "That's ambitious," they said cautiously. "Do you really think we can pull this off?" "I know we can," he replied without hesitation. "But it starts with us. With me. If we don't lead by example, nothing will change." Over the next few weeks, the changes began to take shape. New uniforms were designed with input from flight attendants, resulting in outfits that were stylish, durable, and comfortable. Scheduling policies were revised to prevent burnout, and bonuses were introduced for employees working extra shifts. In coach class, passengers noticed subtle but impactful improvements: larger snack portions, complimentary bottled water, and slightly more legroom thanks to reconfigured seating layouts. Feedback poured in from both employees and passengers. Some praised the updates, while others pointed out lingering issues. But instead of brushing off criticism, the airline embraced it as part of the process. Town halls became a monthly tradition, giving everyone a platform to share their thoughts, openly. Slowly but surely, the culture began to shift. One day, months later, the man received an email from someone he recognized immediately, the older woman from the flight. She thanked him for the recent improvements, saying her latest trip had been noticeably better than before. "It's still not the golden age of flying," she wrote, "but it feels like progress. Thank you for listening, and for caring." Reading her words, he smiled. Progress wasn't perfection, but it was a start. And as long as he kept listening, kept learning, and kept putting people first, he knew the airline would continue moving in the right direction. For the first time in years, he felt proud, not just of the company, but of the community it represented. Flying wasn't just about planes and destinations anymore. It was about connection, and that, he realized, was worth fighting for. Months had passed since that fateful flight, and the man in the hoodie, once just another faceless figure in the crowd, had transformed into a catalyst for change. The airline he led was still far from perfect, but the seeds of transformation were beginning to sprout. Every decision, every policy revision, every small improvement stemmed from one simple truth: people mattered. It started with the flight attendants. When the new uniforms arrived, they weren't just pieces of fabric stitched together. They were symbols of dignity and respect. Designed collaboratively with input from the crew, the outfits were sleek yet practical, made to withstand long shifts without sacrificing comfort. The first time the attendants wore them, there was a noticeable shift in their demeanor. They walked taller, smiled brighter, and carried themselves with pride. Passengers noticed too, often complimenting the fresh professional look. Scheduling changes came next. Double shifts were capped, and overtime pay became non-negotiable. A new system allowed employees to swap shifts more easily, giving them greater control over their work-life balance. For the first time in years, many felt like they could breathe again. One veteran flight attendant summed it up perfectly during a town hall meeting. "I don't feel like I'm drowning anymore. I feel like I can actually enjoy my job and my life." Passenger feedback began rolling in as well. The tiny bags of pretzels had been replaced with heartier snack options: trail mix, granola bars, even mini sandwiches on longer flights. Bottled water was now standard in coach, and though legroom hadn't expanded dramatically, the slight adjustments made a world of difference. Families traveling with children appreciated the added entertainment kits, while business travelers raved about the upgraded Wi-Fi service. But perhaps the most impactful change was the emphasis on communication. Town halls became a cornerstone of the company's culture, held monthly and open to everyone, from pilots and flight attendants to ground staff and corporate executives. Employees were encouraged to speak freely, sharing both praise and criticism without fear of repercussions. Their voices shaped everything from catering menus to onboard safety protocols. One memorable town hall stood out above the rest. A young flight attendant stood up nervously, clutching a microphone. Her hands trembled as she spoke, but her words rang loud and clear. "I've worked here for 5 years," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "And for most of that time I felt invisible, like no one cared what I thought or how hard I worked. But these past few months, things are different. You're listening, and it makes me want to give my best every single day." The room erupted in applause, and the man leading the meeting couldn't help but smile. It wasn't his success, it was theirs. Together they were rebuilding trust, brick by brick. Word of the changes spread quickly, not just within the airline but beyond it. Articles appeared in industry publications, praising the company for its bold approach to reform. Competitors took note, some even adopting similar measures in an effort to keep up. Social media buzzed with positive reviews from passengers who'd experienced the improvements firsthand. "Flying used to feel like punishment," one traveler tweeted. "Now it feels human." Another wrote, "Shout out to airline name for finally getting it right. From the snacks to the service, you can tell they actually care about us." The older woman from that original flight sent another email months later, this time filled with photos of her latest journey. She described how seamless the experience had been, from check-in to landing, and thanked him once again for turning things around. "It's still not 1965, she joked, referencing the golden age of air travel. "But it's close enough to remind me why I fell in love with flying in the first place." Her message stayed with him, fueling his determination to keep pushing forward. He knew the work would never truly be done. There would always be challenges, setbacks, and areas for growth. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful, not just for the airline, but for the future of air travel itself. As he reflected on the journey so far, he realized something important. Real change didn't come from grand gestures or flashy campaigns. It came from listening, from humility, from recognizing that behind every complaint, every suggestion, every frustrated sigh, there was a person, a human being with needs, desires, and dreams. One evening, as he prepared to board yet another flight, this time openly as himself, he paused at the gate and looked around. Travelers bustled about, chatting animatedly or scrolling through their phones. Flight attendants greeted passengers warmly, their smiles genuine. The atmosphere felt lighter, less tense than before. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the plane outside the window. "Look, Mommy, that's ours." The mother laughed, tousling his hair. "Yes, buddy, let's go have an adventure." Watching them, he felt a lump rise in his throat. This was why he did what he did. Not for profit margins or shareholder reports, but for moments like this. For families reuniting. For dreamers chasing horizons. For ordinary people living extraordinary lives. When the flight attendants welcomed him aboard, they recognized him immediately. "Good to see you again, sir," one of them said with a grin. "You too," he replied, returning the smile. "Thanks for everything you do." As he settled into his seat, this time in first class, though he still preferred the view from the back of the plane, he pulled out his notepad. There was always more to learn, more to improve. And as long as he kept listening, kept striving, the airline would continue to evolve, not just as a business, but as a community built on trust, respect, and shared humanity. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its ascent. Outside the window, the city lights faded into darkness, replaced by the vast expanse of stars above. Somewhere out there, amidst the infinite possibilities, lay the promise of a brighter tomorrow.